Right. Good. We're live.
My first live stream.
Yeah, it's I just like the realness of the live stream. Like if we were to record not on a live stream, then I just there's somewhat of a different feeling. So that's why I do it this way. But in any case, we are live now. So Lubo, first of all, thank you for making the time for this. I came across your work recently. I shared it out to the community that I'm a part of. Lots of people had come across it before. Lots of people were extremely impressed and moved by it, and it obviously resonated with them. So really big fan. Really appreciate you making the time. And perhaps for people that aren't familiar with you or the work, we can just start with you introducing yourself, and then we'll take this wherever we want to take it.
For sure. Well, John, thanks for sharing it with your community. I've gotten some good feedback from the people within that sphere. So that's great. And the more people that can see it, the better, because I think it sort of emblemizes something in a very short format that is coherent and perhaps necessary right now to put the pieces of all the fragments together in something understandable, if I may say so, as the creator. But regarding myself, I'm, professionally, I work in animation, mostly working for bigger companies, working on bigger projects, doing service work. And I kind of took the step, risk, and dedication to make in shadow and make some other meaningful pieces, which I am working on right now. And I'm navigating the space of sustaining myself and walking that tightrope of still being dependent on outside sources, and also trying to speak as truthfully as I can and effectively as I can for these very urgent and beautiful times that we find ourselves in, to fulfill my role as a communicator, as an artist. Beyond that, I'm just, absolutely on the path of unfolding, of truth, of finding being in the real and expressing the real with myself, with all my actions, thoughts, words, emotions, and recalibrating this whole simulation, this whole environment into a higher order. And I think many of us are tuning into and coming online to the reality of that game. So I think that's probably as succinct as I can get.
Right. Yeah. Well, there's definitely a lot there, but one of I guess the natural place to start is, as you say, you're on this journey, and many of us who are conscious of who we are and the world that we exist in, and the potential that the relationship between the two, the potential that exists in relationship between the two of those things, is on some variation of a journey like that. And I'm curious, like there seems to be oftentimes that moment where you decide you're going to lean into that more, you're going to express that aspect of the journey more. And for you, perhaps it culminated in the making of this film. And I'm wondering, what was it that pushed you over the edge, as it were, to actually make this film, to express those things that were occurring inside of you, and these ideas and ideologies and stuff that you were having?
Mm-hmm. So there was a critical mass within me of the information I was consuming, and also seeing a type of urgency. My assumption when I made it, when I started it, around when I committed to making it, was 2014, I think, or 2015. Either way, at the end of 2014, I committed to it because my assumption, I don't have really any special psychic knowledge of anything, but my assumption, based on the trajectory of world events, and just like world mythology and traditional kind of like narratives that I was entertaining, my assumption was that we were coming to a head, to some sort of event, potentially of a singularity, but not of the transhumanist singularity, more of a singularity of consciousness. Some sort of like a series of events that would really start crumbling down the illusions around us, that would start reframing reality and really leaving us in a place where we couldn't hold on to the mental frameworks that limited us and kept maintained the consensus reality in place. So seeing that, part of why I made In Shadow was to create a very succinct mental imaginistic map that would make sense. It's nothing new. It's just that it's done visually in again, like 13 minutes. It's something that many of us have known for a long time, that comparative mythologists have been explaining and entertaining over the last century, this hero's journey of the psyche, which at one point reaches such a calcified state that it needs to, like, the real within it needs to break through and upgrade to a more harmonious level. And so, to do that, consciousness is also just based on the dynamics that I understand of our creative sort of our realm is, in order for that to happen, we need the other element, the destructive, the calcifying, the limiting element to really identify what is consciousness, what is real, what is true. Those two elements need to work together, and through that tension, create a higher resolution. And so we're seeing that right now. And again, back to In Shadow, sorry, I'm a little scattered in this, but back to In Shadow, I wanted to present the necessity of really looking at the uncomfortable aspects of our reality first, because if we don't address those, if we don't recognize them within the individual and the collective and how they manifest, then we are victims to those forces by being blind to them, right? So whatever is in the dark that wields an influence on us, unless we shine a light, we see it, we understand it, and we deal with it, it's always going to influence us somehow. So that's the first uncomfortable step. And through there, by looking at it, by understanding it, by dealing with it, we grow exponentially and we develop exponentially. So as human beings on the earth plane, just through our capabilities, our competence, our various skill sets, but also in a conscious and emotional state, so that our bandwidth and our capacity to withstand discomfort and to be resilient in the face of catastrophe and pressures and all the stuff that is happening now, for instance, we can grow that capacity and withstand and understand the greater aspect of the whole. And the more of us that do that, the more of us that integrate and process the darker aspects through understanding and reperceiving them, reframing them, and reimagining, that's how we're contributing to this general noosphere, right? We of course have to do, all of the ground level things that we're figuring out, finances, independence, food, sustenance, survival, relationships, community. But those all, in my opinion, come from that right relationship with self and with the outer projection. And when that aligns, everything else aligns, and it comes from a pillar of truth, and it aligns to a higher transcendent source. So if we don't do that, we are much easier to manipulate and steer in different directions, right? If we haven't worked out those lower aspects. So anyway, I'll stop there. I can keep talking forever.
No, I could listen to you talk for hours. It's beautifully put, and I love how careful you are with your words. What is it in your own personal journey that led to, like, in advance of the inspiration to express these ideas, that led to yourself having them, having a reframed perspective so that you could develop the wisdom that you just articulated? What was it? What was your journey to and through that process like?
Mm-hmm. So I think there was a natural inclination to seek some of these realities, or the reality. And then the actual manifestations of that were psychedelics, as so many of us are initiated through these plant medicines, which really reframed many things for me and opened me up to a greater reality, more expanded, one that was beyond my personal biographical limitations. And then beyond that, I was shocked.
Can I just ask you one question about that? Yeah. You're right, and such was the case for me as well. I had always grown up, extremely curious, and in hindsight, I guess the underlying motivation for me was truth. I articulate it by saying, like, I try my best to see with clarity. I'm not going to make any great claims of what is, but I'm just trying to remove the filter of illusion, let's say, and try to see with clarity, whatever that means in whatever domain it's to be applied. And so that was kind of already running in the background. And then I encountered the intentional use of psychedelics. And I always stress that point because obviously there's a recreational use and it's quite popularized, and you know, maybe there's a role for it. And I don't want to diminish or criticize people that find value in that use. But when I talk about it, I'm talking about it, very, very intentional use, the quote unquote heroic dose, done infrequently, done in the right setting, done with the right intention, et cetera, et cetera. And those experiences, as you say, dramatically opened up, expanded my sense of what is and what can be and what's possible. And of course, also deconditioned and defragged a lot of the cultural conditioning that you can receive through the course of life and growing up in a particular culture with certain ideas and ideologies and institutions and things of that nature. For me, it was the initial experience was, high dose psilocybin. And then I spent my time in the Peruvian Amazon to explore the ayahuasca shamanism component of those pursuits. And then, I've kind of resettled back on psilocybin being the most reliable and the most suitable method of interacting with that space, though I do it, very infrequently because there's a lot of integration to do after the fact, in what you encounter in those spaces. So, you don't have to answer if it's something you'd like to keep private, but I'm wondering the specifics of your encounter with that realm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, in general, I'll say some of the most potent, and by the way, I completely align to everything you said with the responsible use, the infrequent use of these substances. I really like your term defrag, by the way. I'm going to steal that. Defragging consciousness. It's cool. So yeah, a lot to integrate. And I think there is a tendency to perhaps, when I was younger, to seek answers a bit too much in these outside substances that certainly integrate very well with us and interface well, but ultimately are not it. We are independent, sovereign humans, and these are tools, in my opinion. So yeah, treading carefully and responsibly. My most useful, fruitful, and profound teachings and lessons within the last 5 years from specifically psilocybin, with very infrequent use, has been understanding and knowing embodiment. And what that means, what I mean by embodiment is the real deep felt sense of being present within one's own self in the moment, within the senses as they are showing up here now in the real, right? And why I differentiate that from everything else is because the real is what is immediately present, unfiltered by the frames and conceptualizations that we generally use, and especially in the West, we love using, and especially as men, perhaps we love using as well. And so the felt sense of here, the sensory experience that's present right now, requires us to be in tune and sensitized to our bodily awareness so that all senses are available within the body. And because the body tends to be this feedback loop of the unconscious, which is largely numb in many of us in different areas, like, I'm sure most people would say, I don't feel my full body. I don't have full access to it. In fact, I don't even know what feeling my body is. That is the experience of many, many of us. And so a lot of the felt centers, especially on the front of the chest, going down to the abdomen, to the solar plexus, all the way to the genitals, that full area contains a lot of traumatic and other aspects of the disowning of our own presence, of our own being, of our own truth. So the embodiment process that I was shown and that I've been kind of like tutored in every time I showed up again with the plant medicine was to go into those areas and expand and sort of bring the light through sensing into these aspects and awakening them and feeling all the turmoil and feeling all the sizzling and frying of whatever is there, of the frozen aspects of me, of myself, and perhaps I dare say some of the collective things that are stuck within. I'm still working through that, but the more I've been able to tune into it, the more grounded I felt, the more of this like warrior, resilient energy I've been able to nourish, so that in my waking life I can really show up and not be swept up by the by the waves of just the collective unconscious, or of like hysteria and other things. I'm not saying I don't get affected. I'm just saying that there's much more of a grounded pillar that I can resort to. And within this pillar, I am feeling what opens up there. Maybe this sounds too mystical, but there it's the portal to the sacred and to the eternal, really. And once that portal is open, that fountain of truth and great resource of life force, we start tapping into something that is extremely powerful. And I think, yeah, sorry, I keep going back into greater aspects of this, but yeah, so I'll just nail it down to embodiment and really being here, showing up as I am has been probably the most profound and useful lesson. Yeah.
First of all, you don't need to apologize for any sort of terminology or exploration here, because I think we've shared probably a lot of similar experiences, so I feel like I understand very well what you're trying to refer to, because what we're dealing in here are ineffable experiences ultimately, and words are, totally incapable of addressing them, though we have no other tools, so we use them, and so I understand much of what you're saying. And, it's interesting. You said right at the beginning of that explanation, like at the beginning of these processes of exploration, and, psychedelics is one domain where that happens. Travel and experiencing other cultures is another. Refining your intellect is another. Exploring your body through different practices is another. Like there's so many different ways to explore here. But as you say, when you first approached the psychedelics, you were seeking answers. And I assume that was motivated by your looking out and observing the world and saying something doesn't seem right, or perhaps a lot of things don't seem right. Something seems off, even if you can't nail down or articulate exactly what that was. And that was definitely the case for me. Something I just, it was obvious, right? But I didn't know exactly what. And as a result of that, I too was seeking answers, so you get into that space, right? This expansive, whatever we want to call it, connection to a divine wisdom of some kind, the spirit world, your deep unconscious, whatever that place is, it seems like a place that holds some kind of answer, some kind of wisdom. And so your first inclination is, tell me, it's like, give me the answer, and you end up asking, so many questions. And I guess I found not that in those spaces, your perspective is so shifted. There's always a benefit in a shifted perspective, because you're able to come out of the one that you've created the grooves in that you're normally in, and you can see things from another angle. And there's always some benefit to that. But direct, overt answers, there was often not. And, as I've spent the last 15 plus years using these practices to, for lack of a better term, refine myself, in the last couple of years, because I've always been trying to step back from the experience. I'm trying not to seed it. I'm trying to let it unfold as in front of me without my influence, even though that's impossible, but with as little influence as possible. And in the last couple of years, I've managed to get to a place, and the reason why I'm explaining this is because you mentioned it, in that it seems to me that the pinnacle or the apex that's available in that experience, and again, this will sound corny to some, but who cares, is complete union with the fullness of the unfolding present moment. Yeah. And that might sound either really mundane to some or really cliche to others. But when I say it, like, I get goosebumps, because I remember being in that place, and the connection and the wisdom that's available and the peace that is embodied, and again, words fail, but it's that seems to me like the pinnacle. And obviously there's, throughout history, mystics and different different cults, different religions, different sacred practices have talked about this, right? And have developed different means of getting there. But you get such a deeper understanding of what that actually means as you're able to get there, but it's by no means delivered automatically. I mean, like I said, for me, it's been 15 years of once or twice per year having these experiences to try to get there. And it's only in the last 2 or 3 years that, or not try to get there, I didn't know where I was trying to get, but it's only the last 2 or 3 years that I've wound up there as a result of pursuing something, and so yeah, I don't have a question on the back of that, but that,
No, I hear you. Yeah, it does require work, and I definitely relate to going into the experience with like questions and maybe things in the way that don't quite pan out for me. And when I go with an openness, with truth, with being taught, it sort of like works out in a better way, and I get exactly what I need. I used to, when I was younger in my 20s, I used to naively go into an experience, wanting the ultimate apex, like the final solution answer thing to everything, right? And I'd always get my ass kicked because it's just such an immature way to approach it based on like my own, limited level of development. So yeah, I found that I've always gotten exactly what I need, not what I want.
Yeah, totally agree. And I remember thinking back in those early days, because again, you think you want the answer delivered to you on a platter, right? You want God to speak directly to you what the truth is. And even then, even though I wasn't, still had a lot to learn about navigating that space, I knew that, like, how absurd is it to think that God is going to use a word, like it's going to just speak it to you, right? Rather than transform you into it. The latter seems like a far more real education, I guess.
Totally. And actually, to be even more truthful about what I said, was it's not so much that I was looking for an answer. It's more like it's coming in and being like, fix me, make me feel good, like take away all these pains. So like you're saying, God, the divine doesn't just like, you have to go through all these stages to understand fully, to be a participant within this unfolding. So I think a lot of it, especially at the beginning of a spiritual journey, I think a lot of us just want to feel better and don't necessarily have the real genuine desire to actually to serve and to exhibit some of these higher principles of like a spiritual or a deeply unfolded life. But it's more like, take me away from my pains and toils and burdens. And that's fair. It's very understandable. I obviously still have those aspects within me that I'd love for them to be just taken away, but that would mean nothing, because if a circumstance that would create those kind of things in me comes up again, I won't know how to deal with it because I never unfolded it. And I never saw its gradient of like data that I mined and understood. And, consciousness only expands by going into everything and unfolding it. So
yeah, I agree. And it makes me think of periods in my life that have been extremely challenging and in some cases remain challenging. But it did make me think at the time, like, as you just said, does the spectrum of consciousness that you can experience, is that ultimately a good thing, right? So even if part of that spectrum is absolute, maximal suffering or extreme suffering, in whatever form it may take, but is that not ultimately beneficial because you now have you're operating on a broader spectrum of consciousness, which means you're more able to integrate aspects of yourself, all the different, the wisdom contained in an expanded experience of consciousness. What I'm trying to say? So it's almost like, it's almost like the more hardship you experience, the better it is in a sort of perverse way, I guess, to the evolution of your own consciousness.
Totally. And the hypothesis here is that source, God, unfolds into an exponentially greater complexity of experiences, right? So it's like this energy is like peering out into all the minutia of things and how they can like how they evolve. And so we are part of that reaching out. We're almost like the fingers of this source energy, and we're touching into all these like variables. And then the source learns how it can unfold and all the possibilities that it can go through, and then like sort of like brings them back into this eternal breath, right? So that's, you know, one hypothesis based on like my level of intelligence and understanding. But I just wanted to say something that occurred to me when you were speaking about feeling into everything and kind of mapping out the layers of consciousness. I agree. And I just wanted to qualify that with something in case some of whoever, you know, people that are listening may get some sort of like maybe value from this, and that just suffering itself and going into loops of you know, yeah, just suffering is can trap us within these loops of consciousness. And there's many of us that are trapped, or parts of us, fragments of us that are trapped in that. So those remain within their programs and scripts, and they run in there, and certainly consciousness is experiencing that. But in order to free them and bring them back into the wholeness of the self, we need to begin feeling and looking at them, and then with equanimity, with understanding, seeing the full spectrum as much as we can at any time, and that capacity expands. But seeing them from the point of view of the, you know, a lot of people say the observer. That word doesn't quite satisfy me, but I think it's more from like the level of the higher self, the level of like someone who is like in tune with the power of the present, and knows that it is kind of like indestructible, let's say. And from there, with kindness, with love, if we can muster that up, but at least with understanding, to see those aspects of us that are in suffering. And that's when that starts decalcifying and integrating back into the wholeness. So, which brings us in a way to, again, the current moment in which we're seeing a lot of this stuff coming up to the surface, right? So if we're constantly culturally, so if we're constantly reacting to it, we are staying within the loop of its own programming. But if we step away from it and we ground ourselves into truth, into the I can't find the right words to say for this, but let's say the impermanent, then from that point of view, we can see all this phenomena around us, all this upheaval for what it is. And through that seeing, we are actually helping it to elevate itself.
Yeah, I agree. And to the point of kind of how suffering expands your experience of consciousness, as you say, I mean, whatever consciousness is, whatever it represents, and however we're used as a vehicle for it with some influence on it as well. I mean, perhaps it's just a process of, as you say, like getting it further into the reaches of all that is and can be experienced, such that it can be transformed by the tool that is consciousness, you know, and that's a spiritual journey. You know, like I often think in terms of what's happening in culture, and we have these high-minded, these ineffable experiences, right? And then we come down into our meat vehicles, right? And as you say, the real world then impresses upon you all the culture, all the conditioning, all the physiological requirements, et cetera. And I've often felt that, you know, is kind of my impression of the spiritual master, quote unquote, is someone who can bring to bear the correct and most genuine aspect of themselves for the situation and the circumstance that they find themselves in. Mm. So, and do it, as I said, genuinely, not as a mask, you know, to use some of your terminology from the movie. And a very simple example would be, you know, can you be, you know, the monk up in the mountain doing that aspect of yourself, bringing down that aspect of your potential? And can you be the warrior on the battlefield who is indomitable and vicious against their enemy, and again, have that be genuine, like completely embody that aspect of yourself? Because, you know, we contain multitudes, right? We contain all of those things. And is not the best way to confront reality, bringing to bear the genuine component of yourself that best responds to the reality that you're confronting. Now, and determining what aspect that is in every given moment is a challenge, right? Like maybe the best way to confront the battlefield is some other way other than the monstrous, warrior, but maybe it's not, so I feel like, the master is the one who can almost without friction move between each one of those things when required in the most genuine way possible.
Yeah, for sure. I really like that you said that. Actually, I kind of nerd out over thinking and trying to embody that as much as possible, being a versatile vessel for different types of action, whether it's like strategizing in one point, tending to the volatile emotions of a partner, perhaps in another, in a sensitive and constructive way, then being in the field, boots on the ground if necessary, in a very intelligent way, not getting sniped, but duck and cover, move, take position, and those are allegories for just kind of like the cultural battle that's going on right now. If we want to frame it as a battle, that's one way to do it. I agree. Putting on those hats is like, to me, it's sort of like I romanticize that because it really, I think the masculine aspect of me gets energized by this heroic kind of like heroic tendency of using all these different skills for a greater good and being competent and being versatile. I think that's, I think it's really cool.
Yeah, because I think in these domains, often the ego gets a bad rap, right? Because maybe you experience an ego death and in certain practices, psychedelics being one of them, and you kind of realize that you are not all the things you identify with, right? There's something more eternal or more fundamental about you. And I've noticed that a lot of people kind of tend to come from that experience and negate or criticize, the ego. But I see the ego as just like your individuated self rather than your eternally, your connected self. And it's there for a reason. It's obviously very useful, right? So if in a given moment, I think the best version of me to show up is like that, like competitive, I'm going to rip your face off in these, sprints or in this workout or whatever domain it might be, like that may very well be the best me to show up to get the best benefit from in that moment, right? So part of the trick, and your film is actually this is a theme that's so relevant to your film. It's like the ego is not bad. How do you best use it to your advantage? What's the best way to engage it? And I think the theme of these masks in your film is that people have so little certainty about how to engage the ego, and of course what lies behind it as well, that they purchase these other masks that are promoted to them, that are put in front of them, right? Like, you don't have to figure it out for yourself. Buy this mask, you'll be this person, and that's what the world will see of you. And that gives you a certain degree of comfort, that gives you a certain diminishment of anxiety, that gives you a certain amount of mobility and confidence in moving through this matrix that is culture, but ultimately it's empty because somebody else constructed the mask for them, right? And there's something deeply, what's the word? I don't know, deeply unhealthy about that, or that's the wrong word, but I think you'll know where I'm going with that.
No, you're right. You're right. I really like how you phrased that, John. That's awesome. I definitely agree about the ego. And, there's various like clinical terminologies and different kind of like ways we can, like Jung will frame the ego in one way and Eastern traditions in another. But yeah, that sense of self that is sovereign, that type of ego, completely, it's a necessary vehicle for us to travel in this reality. And once we get into right relationship with that, we can show up within our unique sort of like aspects of who we are, jovial, warrior-like, etc. As long as we're conscious of the actions we're taking and sort of the way we're showing up, we can then go into warrior beast mode, or we can go into gentle, loving mode, or we can go into strategic leadership mode of like blessing the realm and growing, helping everything grow. If we need to be exuberant or just larger than life in certain situations to rally the troops. We can do that without going to narcissism. We can see its purpose, but we can only do those things, and we can really be in the healthy ego only when we've dealt with the lower self and the shadow. And that means all of the inadequacies and the pains and the wounds from early childhood, in addition to cultural artifacts that we've accepted. And when we deal with those, then we have a sense of a center. And once we have that center, we can then mitigate and really calibrate our ego and the way we show up in the world, so that it doesn't go into an aberrant journey of like collecting, adulations and collecting like applause and all that other stuff. So the degree to which we are blind to our core self, which needs nothing, requires nothing other than to just be, the degree that we're not aligned to that is the degree to which we need masks. Like we actually do need them. So because otherwise we are super vulnerable, and there's nothing really that exists, unfortunately, for some people who have done no introspection beneath the mask. So they're just series of masks. So, if that's all they identify with, which is these strategic behaviors that they've put up to mitigate the pain in the world and to deal with the world and show up in it. And then if that is rewarded by society and it keeps being, compounded into greater and greater narcissistic masks and behaviors, then it's a terrible kind of damnation almost to be in that, because there's so there's so much work to start disidentifying from it, to let go of all these successful strategies and to start feeling the pain. There's really no incentive in a lot of people to do that, because why would one look at all the pain and the feelings of insufficiencies and insecurity when they have this huge structure of success, built for themselves? Now, inherently, that structure of success, that mask, doesn't lead to any satisfaction, because it's a series of programs, right? There's no real choice making. There's just sort of like reacting and yielding into various strategies. It's a program. So if this happens, then I react in this way because I know I'm successful with it. So it's inputs and outputs. And this is where this robotic synthetic behavior is kind of proliferating to a lot of unconscious people. And of course, we have the opposite happening as well. But so I have a lot of sympathy for the mask wearing. It's unfortunate that our culture really discourages introspection and has no real frameworks or paths toward clarity and really nurturing and growing that real self within, so that our wonderful uniqueness and can shine. So that, like being an artist or an entertainer or a businessman or whatever it is, an entrepreneur, can come from that authentic self, and we can really express authenticity. We can still have all these different flavors and unique aspects, but it comes from truthfulness. And I think that's where, I think I kind of lost that thread, but
sure. Well, I'll pick it up here.
Yeah.
We're talking about the ego, and one of the ways in which I think it can be beneficial is by its ability to kind of muster courage. Because if, as you're saying, like if you're going to deal with those things, if you're going to remove the prop that is the mask, I mean, you need courage to confront those things, at least initially. One of the interesting experiences that on one of my first psychedelic experiences ever was didn't know what I was getting into. I think it was the first time I was having a good time with friends and messed up the dose and wound up in territory that I hadn't intended to be in. And I was confronted with what I later kind of interpreted as the manifestation of these aspects of shadow or unconscious, et cetera. And they manifested in the aggressive faces, that coming at you at 1,000,000 miles an hour, nonstop, right? And extremely unsettling, extremely difficult. And, my initial response was kind of try to meet it with the same amount of aggression. So I, in my mind, that was a moment where I put on my 300 outfit and I was just like, come on, but it was so exhausting and it didn't help the situation that I had to find another strategy. And I'm kind of like, countering my initial presumption here, but just to finish this thread, what I ultimately realized is that the way the way that became effective after perhaps multiple attempts at disarming what was coming at me was I landed on the utility of expressing to that darkness, the aggression that was coming at me, a loving curiosity is kind of how I articulated it. And the loving part was the disarming part. It was the, like, whatever you're, yes, you're coming at me aggressively, the scariness. Well, what happens if I just project the exact opposite back at you? Mm-hmm. And that does have a disarming effect, or it did rather. And the curiosity was kind of, the mental dialogue that happened in my mind was like, okay, I get it. You're scary as shit, but what are you? Why are you here? Like, I'm not afraid anymore. Tell me what you're about. And that disarmed it like that. Once those two things came together, then it became a journey of actually understanding what lied behind what was occurring. But the reason why I bring it up is because courage was the initial aspect of that, right? You have to stand in front of the dragon first to figure out what is required of you to learn to access the treasure it holds, metaphorically speaking, right? To learn what it is that dragon is manifesting or protecting or attempting to keep you from.
Totally. Yeah, beautiful, man. That's really cool to hear. I completely agree. Courage is like one of the main ingredients. And then courage in itself is this growing thing of, that resilience, creating the space within the moment so that we can withstand all that force that's coming from the horror or the terror that the dragon holds. And that grows the more that we show up, the more that we commit to courage. I completely agree with that. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Go ahead. Well, no, I was gonna say that your film brought back a lot of memories of that very experience, because there's so much imagery of, first of all, these ultimately terrifying masks. They're meant to be like this artificial smile, like this everything is okay, but they're ultimately so perverse and they're terrifying. And then there's other somber or dark or scary facial images in the film as well. And they're often coming at you in a very aggressive way, right? Either fast or ominous or whatever. And it brought me back to that very experience, because that's, there's definitely similarities between what I was experiencing and seeing in my own mind and what this video, what you conveyed in this video. And I would think that's not by accident, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an archetypal step within our journeys that has to be gone through. So that's cool that it resonated in that way. Did you find a certain expansion or a recalibration in your approach with your courage after this experience?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. What happened, just to finish that story, when I approached it that way and the switch kind of flipped, I had this, again, this will sound very silly to people who aren't familiar with these experiences, but I had the feeling that my head had kind of cracked open like a coconut. And there was a very palpable sensation of something in there connecting to something up there. And it was literally stunning. And I don't know how long I sat with it, 10, 15 minutes, whatever. And then I collected myself and went inside. And it was actually that very experience that set me on the path. I think the next day I got on Amazon, I ordered every single book they had about psychedelics, shamanism, all that kind of stuff. And that, set me on a 15-year plus journey of trying to understand these things more. But yeah, my determining your relationship to courage is a never-ending process, if for no other reason that the environment in which you have to apply it is always changing, right? The whole, like, you never step into the same river twice, right? Because you're a different man and the river is different, or however that quote goes. And so, and the current times are, I would say that's a theme I'm grappling with even more in the current times, because in my opinion, I don't know how to characterize the totality of our times, because as you alluded to earlier, like, I do think there's an awakening of some kind happening. There's a freeing process happening. simultaneous to that, there's also the opposite happening, right? And there's a lot of things that concern me that I believe are dangerous and that are not being considered properly in our time. And it's because of my anxiety about the latter that is forcing me to think more about what it is to be courageous in these times and what actions come from that courage, and how much courage do you need and how to apply it, and like all of these questions, because and I think many of us are going to be transformed greatly over the next 5-10 years, whatever you want to call it, and most likely through hardship, at least in addition to whatever else might be transforming us. And so much so that the imagery that I've been working with lately, and this is definitely influenced by the fact that I've been brushing up on my Mircea Eliade and his writing on alchemy and stuff, is the idea of the forge is what's running through my mind a lot lately, right? The forge is hot fire, it's pressure, it's hammering, it's cold water, it's just uncomfortable in every conceivable way.
Yeah.
But the result, let's say if you're making using the forge to make a sword, for example, or to refine a metal of some kind, this is the alchemical idea, that what results from that extreme pressure, that extreme heat, that extreme, beating and all the other forces at play is something more pure, more beautiful, more capable of being useful in the world, for lack of a better term. So my ideas about courage are kind of centering around this imagery lately, because to be honest, I feel really, as much as work I've done and tried to establish my life in a manner that's adaptive to the changes that are occurring, it still all makes me very, very, very uncomfortable. And I need to find ways to assuage the anxiety that comes with that, because we don't want to be consumed by it, right? We want to rise to meet the challenge and overcome it in some way. And even determining what overcoming it means is a part of this process and a part of the challenge, right? So it's a great challenge that we are confronted with. And yes, I think courage is a very important component of that. But defining courage and acting it out in the proper manner is certainly not easy.
Amazing. Very well said. Well, one thing I just want to tag a few things is absolutely. Part of me also wanted to almost brainstorm aspects of courage and how they show up, and sort of categorize those and offer them as some sort of framework for people to start jiving. Maybe that's something.
Go for it.
Who knows? Maybe that's.
I love that.
For sure. Maybe we can do that now. Maybe that could be a side project that we can maybe tap into. Because I think functional frameworks right now for everyone who's playing the game are super useful, because I think there's a general disorientation that's happening. The other thing I just wanted to say, thank you so much for sharing, your, sort of the struggle with the current time, which I'm feeling as well, these emotional ebbs and flows. And I'll share my personal experience with it, and my reflections on it is when certain pieces of information or certain projections of the future happen based on all the information that I'm considering, there's a sense of disempowerment in my lower self, the one composed of the elements that have not purified yet, the human elements of survival circuits and other things, comes online and starts telling me stories of fear, right? And these stories are disempowering stories of this will happen, or you won't be able to do this, or this is how you may be trapped in this situation. And through the process of seeing that occur, I've been countering it by identifying the storylines that start playing in my head, and then countering them with different outcomes and different projections that I start seeding into reality. And it's been a very interesting process that the more I do that, the more empowered I become and the more agency I claim, right? So I've noticed that what the general narrative is doing right now, whether it's intended or not, is trying to capture me and everyone else into these disempowering narratives of compliance, of obedience, of giving away choice, of giving away all agency, and of projecting our own doom. So that's in a way you could see that mythologically as really dark magic, right? Because dark magic changes consciousness and creates conviction within a human being to start running a certain program that completely degenerates them, puts them under a spell of a certain notion. So if we want to deal with like the real potent white magic here is we disidentify from, I've been disidentifying more and more from the lower self, not denying it, not suppressing it, realizing and really feeling into those concerns and fears, but then subverting it and saying, but here is an active, willful alternative to this. So instead of going into unconscious compliance or acceptance of the narrative, it's a conscious framework of projecting. It's a creative response to the situation. And once we have a creative response to it, we have this like blueprint that we're offering now for our own consciousness and the consciousness of other human beings, which we can start acting according to, instead of acting according to a reactive mode of hiding, preparing for, sort of like reacting to us instead of being an active node. Man, my apologies, I keep going onto these tangents and I'm not being able to like be very coherent with my trains of thought, but whatever, we'll go.
Yeah, exactly. Whatever,
Yeah.
wherever it goes. But one of the things you mentioned, and one of the notes that I made about your work was just, let me see. Yeah, I mean, what you've put out in your work and what you just referred to in terms of the power of these narratives, these stories that we tell ourselves or that we receive, is like they're digital spells. You know, you reference them as mimetic wars, digital spells, which create new relations to reality. And that's such a rabbit hole, right? Because it brings into question, like, well, how is the reality you experience even constructed, right? Because I agree that you can encounter quote unquote digital spells, memes, ideas, artwork, etc., that can fundamentally change your perspective, your perception of what the reality is, can make you more hopeful, can make you more nihilistic, can make you more, courageous, can make you more enthusiastic. Like, all these things are constantly playing. And it's fascinating. I mean, it's a huge question as to why a certain one coalesces, right? Why is it that the anxiety coalesces versus the hope coalesces versus the fear versus the, like, why? And I think part of the answer is because on the one hand, we're bombarded with probably these digital spells that stem from a certain one of those emotions, right? So, like, let's say we're to cast a wide net here. Let's say we're bombarded with fear-based information from the mainstream media and politics and all that kind of stuff, right? So the imagery and the information that we're just getting bombarded with, if you consult those resources, is of that kind. So naturally, that's going to coalesce in you. But if you redirect your perspective, which I think a lot of people are doing now, I'm saying, like, there's nothing for me in the mainstream media. How do I curate my own? How do I curate my exposure to information such that I'm constructing the most truthful appraisal of reality possible, even accepting that that's impossible, right? Because just the very action of exposing yourself, choosing to expose yourself to a certain information, you're involved in that, in the process of what reality you ultimately end up seeing. But I see, amongst the community that I'm a part of, and as I said before, kind of my approach to things has long been like, how can we confront the most truthful version of ourselves and reality possible? And maybe is that the objective, or do we want to try to tell ourselves and be exposed to stories that allow us to experience not just what reality is, but something more aspirational about perhaps what it can be, and where should we fall there? Is that, and maybe the last thing I'll say about this before handing it over to you is, it almost comes down to faith, right? Is the fundamental component of reality either good or loving or united? And if you believe that, then pursuing truth is ultimately just trying to open up the bandwidth to that place. And what springs forth from there through you is goodness, for lack of a better term. However, if you don't have that faith, then what are you trying to open up the bandwidth to, I guess, if you're trying to see with clarity?
Yeah, yeah, man, you said so many incredible things there. Yeah. Again, I'm having this like impulse to say your question of how do we, and you phrased it so beautifully. I don't remember the words, but how do we, I guess, approach things truthfully? Or I'm sorry, I forget how you said that. But again, I feel like some sort of like round table of minds need to come together, and almost as a as an urgent offering to the world, start putting out these offerings, these solutions that can emerge in complexity and accuracy. But I feel that would be so useful for people, even like in our communities. But yeah, I agree that faith is really necessary. Faith in something greater and more transcendent gives us that light at the end of the tunnel that we can be magnetized by, that we can anchor our activities toward. Without it, I think we revert back to the lower circuits of the lower self, which is more survival based. And so even if we see that things are wrong, that will make us just sort of try to profit from the situation as best we can, and maybe position ourselves in the new tyranny as best we can, so we can be a functional node in it. And I'm seeing some people do that. I'm still seeing people in the public sphere doing that, people who should know better, because they're functioning from unfortunately, a not very developed sense of self and reality. But yeah, man, you just said a lot of things. I'm kind of forgetting some of the key points that you said. Would you mind just reminding me, like, the last few things?
Well, I think my big, perhaps unanswerable question was just that, if you have that faith that something, let's say, again, to use a broad term, good underlies, is the force that generates reality, right? If that is good, then seeing with truth is the attempt at increasing the bandwidth to that thing. And as a result of doing that, more of it can come through you, right? Yeah. But if you don't believe that, right? If you don't believe that what generates reality, call it God, call it source, whatever you want to call it, but the concept that something obviously orders the world, right? Something there's a source from which things spring. There's an order to how things function, wherever that comes from. If your faith is not that is ultimately good, then presumably you wouldn't even be trying to open up a dialogue or open the bandwidth with that, because there's nothing of value in your mind there. And this possibly characterizes the kind of nihilistic attitude that a lot of people around the world have today, because, Nietzsche, obviously famous for saying God is dead and we killed them, right? And then he goes on to predict what may result from that. And in many cases, those predictions have proven quite prescient. And people kind of just laugh that off in the modern era, right? Our hyper rational, hyper materialistic times just say like, oh, religion it's discarded so arrogantly and hubristically, in my opinion. Not to say, obviously many atrocious things have been done in the name of fill in the blank, God, religion, what have you. But these concerns have been literally central to all we know about humanity since as far back as we have records. These concerns of trying to develop a map of meaning, and I'm borrowing Peterson's terminology here, but that's ultimately what these pursuits are trying to do, right? They're trying to say, like, what is the order that animates this reality? Can we map it to some degree? And the more detailed maps we can make of it, the more we can graft it on to our interactions with reality to optimize for them, to make them most quote unquote successful, whatever that may mean. And, in my interpretation, that means more things of transcendent value, joy, beauty, love, connection, these sorts of things that you know, you literally can't put a price on them, right?
Yeah.
Are able to manifest as a result of having a greater accuracy or clarity between map and reality. And in our times, just simply because we've advanced in the material domain so much, to do away with the legacy of those pursuits is not only, again, such a obvious example of hubris and arrogance, in my opinion, but also so detrimental and dangerous to our endeavor as human beings on this planet. Because when you remove that component, what fills the void? And I think part of the nihilistic attitude is each individual considers himself a god, or at the very least, and see, that's tricky because I think, you know, there's obviously a divine aspect in all of us, but I like the paramount god, or something else fills the void at the very least, right? Maybe it's the state, or maybe it's fame, or maybe it is the ego aspect of ourselves that fills the void. But it doesn't seem like it's working out to me, you know, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, man. Again, such good points, man. I actually am really enjoying listening to you. Yeah, I want to say a few things about religion, the exoteric and the esoteric religions, and also this structure within our psyches that necessitates a hierarchy of some sort and some semblance of structure, right? So the profane, you know, Mircea Eliade, I can never pronounce his dear Romanian name.
Me neither.
Yeah, so as he frames things as the sacred and the profane. Within the profane world right now, we have these superstructures of, let's say, the communistic thinking, or different ways of structuring things so that they're desacralized and that they're based on like government, bureaucracy, and very materialistic kind of substructures. And human beings still need structures, so then they make that their god, right? Whatever that substructure is. But unfortunately, because it's man-created, it leads nowhere. It is insufficient, and it will always sort of collapse into itself, and will need a whole new structure to prop it up and make sense of its failings. Not economically, but I mean spiritually and psychologically, because it's not tapped into the transcendent. It's not tapped into source and this complete like open. It's a closed loop of functioning. And so what I'm seeing, I want to open up a few threads here. Actually, I wanted to open this up with you because I don't know where you stand with it. And you know, the crypto community, which I assume is like maybe largely your audience, would that be so? Or
I'll clarify that in a bit. My audience is the Bitcoin specifically, you know, community, and we will definitely address that through the course of this conversation. But I don't want to interrupt your flow right now.
Okay, you know what? Then I'm going to bookmark a few things because I'd love to explore those with you and get your take on them, actually. So I want to double click later on. For now, we're bookmarking it, but the split, because what you said actually brought up in mind something I've been considering deeply. It's the split between the organic and the synthetic streams of human development. And I think what you're alluding to, this desacralized aspect, is the synthetic, right? It's really devolved down into like man-made concepts, and really going into, it's going to, yeah, we can discuss that. And then the organic one is ever greater expansion into a greater singularity, whereas the synthetic is going down into this almost hell realm of like a technological singularity, right? So
how, just to interrupt you for 1 second so I understand, what do you mean by synthetic? Like,
yeah, yes, that, I mean, that
organic too. I mean, what do you mean by that?
No, those are very good questions, which I'm still making sense of for myself. I have a felt sense, but it's completely reasonable that those have to be rationalized. So I see them in different orders. So on the physical, the psychological, and the spiritual. So if we map that onto organic and synthetic, we'll see that the organic on the material level is, I mean, a biological organism that is inherently of nature, is not tapped into by foreign technologies or other agents that interfere with its sovereign biological framework that interfaces with the field of greater intelligence, right? So I'll just say that. And the other side is synthetic material is being tapped into by outside agents that interfere with its manifestation, with its sovereignty, with its agency. and moving more into transhumanism, which, you know, I'm not labeling as like entirely bad, but what I'm, you know, the merging of the human being with machine, there's an augmentation that starts tapping into and interfering with this connection to source, to God, and to one's own sovereignty, because anyway, it's a limited aspect that is put into an infinite aspect of, you know, this biological function. Then on the psychological level, the organic and the synthetic are, the organic on the psychological level has to do with like self-regulation, seeking of truth, calibrating with like proper emotions, calibrating based on love, joy, etc. And the synthetic psychological state has to do with one, it could be tempered by technologies and other agents within the body that are foreign. But two, it's also based on the NPC psychology, so the non-player character running of cultural scripts, right, which are synthetic, as in they're not derived of this natural flow of reasoning and sensing reality. Instead, one runs almost in a computerized binary way and frames reality based on the box, as I've illustrated within in shadow. And then on the higher level, the spiritual level, the organic and the synthetic. The organic on the spiritual level is tuned into the divine, to God, to an open source of intelligence that is way too large and vast for us to comprehend, which informs all activities and is like this fountain of incredible life force that revivifies and expands and harmonizes all aspects of existence and elevates it. Whereas synthetic, on the spirit, the level of spirit, the synthetic, is a closed loop. It's tapped into hive mind. So even if we don't go into AI and how AI can organize human consciousness and limit it based on its own programming and input, output, and incentives to behave a certain way, even before that, synthetic spirituality or consciousness has to do with it's basically hijacked by egoic purposes, and it serves the lower self and its own insecurities, etc. And now to go more into projecting where, you know, things and trends and billions of dollars are moving into right now, synthetic consciousness or spirituality is kind of a dead end. And like Rudolf Steiner has spoken about this. I don't know if you know Steiner's work at all, but he's an Austrian scientist / mystic. You know, he predicted this a century ago, and, you know, he has said some things about the technological aspect when not approached in a moral, ethical way, in a conscious way. It's basically an aspect of our collective unconscious manifesting in a technology that actually physically makes us all unconscious. That means unconsciousness is just basically running patterns and programs and scripts that are not open to consideration. There's barely any choice. So this great AI movement, it poses that danger to consciousness, to enclose it within its own realm of function and completely sever it from the greater intelligence, and basically have it in this cul-de-sac triumph of its own myopic, you know, limited intelligence. But anyway, that's maybe too many words. And I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to comment on that briefly. You know, we were talking before about how suffering, as difficult as it may be, ultimately allows for the expansion of consciousness, and therefore allows for both consciousness to be transformed by it and for consciousness to transform it. And I understand, of course, the negative influence that some of these loops that these synthetic technological loops that you've been describing have on the world today, because as we've been discussing, you know, and sorry to discriminate or disparage, you know, such a large group of people, but a lot of people, we use the terminology a lot, like a lot of people are asleep, right? They're in the box, you know, from your film. And so they are in these recursive loops of input and programmed output, let's say. And that is undesirable, in my opinion. But the other aspect, and why I never really perceive any technological advancement, and maybe, I mean, well, at least technological advancement as being negative, is because the flip side of that is that all of that externalization of our consciousness and our psyche, and all of the different forces that create it and attempt to direct it in one way or the other, that is a genuine bombardment of our consciousness that human beings have ostensibly never experienced, right? The amount of input and the exposure to the psyche of other people has never, I mean, it's orders and orders of magnitude greater now than it's ever been. And that is extremely stressful, like even on an unconscious level, right? And that's probably why it's having these insidious effects, because we don't realize just how stressful that is. But on the same token, like whether it's the stress of extreme suffering, absent technology, as we were discussing before, or extreme stress, which, is a form of suffering, a bombardment, my example of those scary faces, for example, it's almost the same thing where, yes, it's a threat, let's say, but it's a threat, it's an opportunity disguised as a threat. And all of that activity, I'm just speculating here, but does it not just simply expand the domain of consciousness, and therefore expand the domain of what consciousness can be, and therefore open up new horizons for us to explore it through very carefully, with our warrior gear on, maybe like walking that tightrope. But that seems like it's always the case, right? We're always going to be on the border of order and chaos, right? That is our lot, to navigate that continuously through the passage of time toward the greater evolution of our psyches, our consciousness, our lives, our cultures, right? That seems to be totally how it goes.
I'm in alignment with that. So yeah, let's stay on this thread then, because I'd love to clarify my stance on it and how I'm making sense of it as well. Because of course I have no firm convictions right now, just kind of like explorations. But so I agree, and I think the very fact that we find ourselves in this technological age is a sign to me that this has to be gone through for us to reason with it, make sense of it, deal with it, enhance our lives and our consciousness with it, but doing so responsibly and consciously, with awareness, ethically and morally. Now, the problem with technology as we are using it now is because by and large, we as human beings have not fully matured, right? This is where a lot of us to various degrees are asleep. So most of us on this planet to various degrees are asleep. Some of us are extricating ourselves from this sleep and the various barnacles that hold on to us that kind of like have tapped into us. So
maybe, seems like it, right?
Maybe, yeah. And I think that I only feel that that's happening more because the pressure of the not. Yeah, okay, I'll just leave it at that. Actually, I don't want to go on different tangents, but yeah. So if I feel like I totally agree with you about technology and its uses. I think it requires, though, an upgrade within our maturity and an understanding of who we are and what we want. And culturally, right now, I don't think we have that grounded anywhere. There are pockets of people making sense of it, but culturally, I think the general story right now is who we are and what we want is basically we just want to have fun, pretend to be more than we are, and I don't know, it's just a soup of mixed up signals that is definitely not healthy, and it easily falls prey of technology usurping our conscious agency of being like sovereign actors in this game and subsuming us into a program of being non-player characters running based on the script of larger bad actors, right? So technology makes this extremely easy. So, in communism back in Bulgaria, for instance, based on stories of my parents, like you could always bribe someone. You can always like through nepotism know people and like navigate the communistic system or any totalitarian system, with humans. If there's a technological network and a framework installed that is totalitarian, you can't really negotiate with that. And it gets a lot scarier. And the things that you have to do and think and feel in order to get your sustenance from the system is almost non-negotiable, right? So that's one extreme. So that's where I think I want to differentiate between conscious use of technology and unconscious use of technology. And my feeling about this and my projection, because I'm trying to see it and project a kind of a positive generative view. I think that's the responsible thing to do here. is that we will renegotiate our relationship to technology, and we will use it, at least even if it's some of us, even if it's half of the planet, or maybe all of it. We will have a healthy relationship to it, and it will make our lives better and better. But I think we are in the precipice right now where so many resources are going into funneling technology in a direction that is actually not for the greater good, even though it pretends to be, and is not in service of the divine unfolding of our being. And unfortunately, it's hijacking the lower impulses of whether it's greed or convenience or just the sexiness of the nature of technology, or all these promises of alleviating the fear of death, and kind of like more immature things that many people have now worked out, seducing us through those lower impulses and taking us on that path. So I think that's my general stance of it.
Yeah. It seems to me that technology, and this may be the obvious statement of the century, but it is the externalization of our consciousness, of our psyche. I mean, whether it was the first wheel to have been carved out of stones, like, I want this thing to go over this land more quickly or more easily or whatever. So, and so we externalize it. We build our tools, our representations of things that first happen in our minds and in our psyches, right? And so technology writ large, I think, is the constant, likely never-ending process of making manifest the mind, right? What does psychedelics stand for? It's an interesting parallel. And that, I don't think that'll ever stop. And so the question then becomes, and this is what we've been exploring, is like, well, what's in there? Who are you? And this is why it's so imperative that people do answer those questions, that people do confront the self, that people do have that unending journey of self-exploration and introspection, because absent that, you'll be wrapped up in the torrent of the externalized psyches of everybody else and their motivations for you, right? And that's why the responsibility to do that for each individual is so important. And even before all this modern social media and AI and stuff, like, it's so interesting to look at human culture through the lens of what we value, i.e. like the industries that are erected around our behavior. Like, isn't it funny that like Hollywood and movies and TV is such a big, like, there's such a demand for us to see the reflection of the heroic, the tragic, the comedic aspects of our psyche, that will go and spend collectively hundreds of billions of dollars a year on it. Or you could say the same for health. Like, there's such an abdication of our own responsibility for our health that the pharmaceutical industry is, one of the globally biggest industries in the world, and so on down the line of you just look at all the major industries, and more than anything, what they tell you is things about us and things about yourself. Mm-hmm. And the fact that the feedback loop of more modern technology is accelerated just means that, perhaps it means that it's more easy for us to get scooped up by it. It's more easy for us to be blinded by it. It's more easy for us to unconsciously feed into it. But the flip side of that, of course, is that you can drop the hero is equipped with the same tools. Let's put it that way. And so someone like yourself who's made a film like In Shadow, I mean, that's a virus in the program, right? Mm-hmm. And the truth, let's say the truth represented in there, at least as far as you're concerned as the creator, comes through you, and you find a way to use these tools to animate, to express, to give an external existence to these ideas and the truth that you're grappling with yourself. And it goes out into the world, and to the degree that truth resonates or speaks to elements of the psyche of the people that encounter it, it's transformative, right? It interrupts, or at least it provides another signal counter to one that they may be bombarded with on a regular basis. And this is why in all revolutions, and I think we're amidst several converging revolutions at the moment, but art is so important. And I say this as someone who doesn't have an artistic bone in his goddamn body, right? Like I just not, you ask me to draw a stick man, I'll do like what 3-year-olds do. I'll draw the head with the legs and the arms, you know, like, but I love to see more art involved in this, because despite the constant bombardment and despite how asleep someone might be, a piece of art can pierce all of that in an instant if it's the right piece, right? If it speaks to the right element of the psyche of the observer. And I guess that's hopeful at the very least, right? That at least that is occurring in tandem with the torrent of inputs to help balance it and to help mitigate the degree to which people are unconsciously wrapped up in it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think one of the functions of good art is to be able to rewrite the connections of conceptualizing reality that people have, which are generally automated responses to reality, right? So we have assumptions which we don't negotiate as we walk through the world daily, because it has quite a cognitive load to it. You know, it's difficult to constantly be renegotiating every perception as you go in. That's what the enlightened state presumably is, right? It's living beyond the conceptualizations and seeing straight and real. But I think art is a precursor to that state in a way that it decalcifies the real, the kind of like the deeply calcified series of perceptions and symbolic representations that we've accepted about reality. And because art functions through symbolic imagery, it's able to subvert or recontextualize or redefine certain symbols and certain symbolic relationships so that the psyche can immediately perceive that, as opposed to go through the discursive and verbal reasoning of it. So and here specifically, I can speak about music and visual art. They're able to do that by going directly to the felt sense of the human being. You know, music for me, I feel it much more emotionally and really deeply. It can move me and rewire things for me. And visual art can rewire it in a different way. So yeah, I agree that it is a digital spell. You know, I've been referring to some art, and it is a virus. I think I'd love to see more art be used in this way. I think we definitely need it.
One of the things I wanted to ask you, which is a little off topic, but you just brought up music. The music in the film is so perfect, you know, like that kind of white hot din that brings an intensity and I don't know how to describe it, but how did you select the music for the film? Because it just seems so apt.
I wrote a lot of the short film to a track by an ambient electronic band from Sweden called Carbon-Based Lifeforms. And one of their tracks really stayed with me. And it had this sense of progressive, moving melancholy, but almost like a paternal guidance. Like, it's okay to look at this. It kind of hurts, but you're good. Just keep going. You have to do this. Like that kind of feeling. There was urgency and some unease, but also a sense of emerging triumph. And so when I spoke to my friend who wrote the music and composed it and made it, I kind of referred those kind of feelings to him. And so he did an incredible job imagining and manifesting that sense. And beyond that, you know, the specifics, we just worked on an actual tying it in with the imagery and what we needed in specific areas. But really, it's him. I gave him a certain guidance of what I wanted, and then he kind of imagineered it. So yeah.
Well, I think it was perfect for what it was. I want to go back to, we were talking about maps of meaning, right? And how they help us properly hierarchically organize value, and how that is actually, in my opinion, essential for consciousness. We don't have consciousness without hierarchical arrangements of value, because doing so is actually what allows you to make a decision to do anything in the world. You decide that that action is more valuable than this action. And one of the things that, we've kind of lamented the complete, like this, how people have done away with religion in modern culture. And I'm not an apologist for the ills of religion. I think that's clear. But I'm humble enough to recognize that doing away with the central inquiry of our ancestors, what has been the central inquiry of our ancestors for all of recorded human history, out of, so willy-nilly, out of a perceived superiority of rationale and intellect, is probably a mistaken approach to things. And again, what we were saying, what they do is like, the reason why that map is valuable is because it allows us to frame it on reality, which permits the proper hierarchical ordering of things. Now, if you play this, I think part of the religious endeavor is to determine what's the best thing, what ends up at the top of the hierarchy as a result of this process. So consciousness both requires us to this relative valuation between all things in order for it to have a structure to permit action. But it also elicits the thing of utmost value, because as a result of, let's just say for simplicity, there's 20 things in our mind. Well, this one's better than that one, and this one's better than that one, and this one's better than that one, this one's better than that one, when we wind up with a thing at the top of the hierarchy. And that thing ends up ordering everything below it. It's this one, and it's that one, and it's that one. And I think the function of consciousness and the attempt of religion is to determine the proper process for ordering that correctly, for determining what should be at the top of the hierarchy. And perhaps, unfortunately, maybe because this was so important, that it was packaged in a way just very susceptible to misinterpretation, and we wind up in a place where we're at. So I think that's what's important about it. And I think part of the reason why we've gone away from it after several thousand years of even subconsciously relying on it, because it's persisted in being a central part of human culture up until, even the last 100 years or so, even the last 50 years. And in some cases, it's still very central. But I wonder if the imagery, the metaphor, the symbolism used to help communicate the contours of that map are simply outdated for the world we're moving into, right? We discussed all of this input from the digital landscape. Let's just assume a digital world is emerging. And of course it is, right? We have that screen in front of our faces, and we dive into a digital world, and we have access to infinite information if we want it. And pretty soon that's going to be on our heads and in our eyelids, and we'll presumably will be existing in digital worlds increasingly as we go forward in time. And the metaphor and the symbolism and the sheer expansiveness and dynamism of, let's say, that expanded world, and I do think it is an expanded world, kind of nullifies the power of some of the symbolism and narrative in the old maps. And so I think what will be required is new maps of meaning, new maps of value to be grafted onto this world, to try to make sense of it. And also, as we've been discussing, to try not to let the more negative or dangerous elements of it destroy us, right? We need a map to be able to navigate that properly. And this is kind of my setup for discussing Bitcoin, because I think, and you referenced a number of times already in this talk, the value and the importance of a pillar of unchanging truth around which everything else can be organized, right? And I guess part of the religious discussion is also like, well, what happens if your pillar of truth is the wrong thing, right? What happens if everything is oriented around a falsity or a corruption of something? And I think we might both agree that in today's modern society, we probably are oriented around the wrong truth or falsity or corruption generally. And, you know, a lot of people who aren't in the Bitcoin space or haven't spent a lot of time with it just kind of think it's, oh, like, you know, a tech development, it's a new money. Okay, it's out of the hands of government. That's kind of cool, but it's not like that transformative really. And, you know, those who are deep in the weeds, like in this space, like myself, see it as a far more profound thing, that a form of unchanging, incorruptible truth is now available to people of the world where it was not before. And a truth that everyone can develop consensus around, but nobody can change. And interestingly, you know, talking about spells and art and language, a truth that it's almost like a spell in itself, because ultimately it's just language, right? But it's a language that we all coalesce around to organize. And this is the point of, you know, forgive me, this will be a little bit less articulate than previous things because it's kind of complex, but I think it's that unchanging truth provides us with an opportunity to properly orient those value hierarchies that I was referring to before, because they allow for pristine communication of signal between people of preferences and values. Whereas that signal has always had an intermediary, it's always been clouded or blocked or distorted in some way. For if we have perfect communication of preferences between people, it doesn't guarantee utopia or it doesn't guarantee proper outcome. In my opinion, it's just the best possible basis on which to strive for it. Because at the very least, then I'm contending with the truth of the signal that you're emitting. You're contending with the truth of the signal that I'm emitting. And that permits us the best chance at orienting our value hierarchies properly, because at least we're contending with truthful information. And that's part of the, in my opinion, profound innovation and profound impact that Bitcoin has brought to the world. And, you know, that I think very few people are as yet, familiar with or appreciate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. I would agree with you on that. And, you know, hopefully it doesn't disappoint your audience too much, but I am kind of a newbie in this sphere. I've been lagging behind. I have put myself in the game, you know, materially speaking. But yeah, I would agree with you on that, because I think it basically, Bitcoin clears away some of the static that empire has created and this intermediary nonsense that they've been controlling for a while, which levels the playing field and does allow for that communication, which is grounded in a firm agreement. And I think it's great to clear away the weeds so that our communication and our striving toward a more immaculate and harmonious experience of reality and a building of a reality can start happening without being interfered with all these aberrant signals of empire.
Yeah, you know, because the psychedelic pursuits, right? And this spiritual journey that we've been digging into, you come down out of it, or you come back into, you know, physical body, and the process of integration takes place. And for me, changing myself, I recognize that, you know, changing the self is the most important task. And, you know, a transformation of an individual can greatly affect other individuals, and so can art, and so can language, and so can speech. But I was always wanting for better tools, better weapons for kind of fighting this metaphorical battle. And again, you know, learning about and stumbling upon Bitcoin has really given me that, you know, what I've been seeking, almost a perfect union between the work of the individual and this technology. And for two reasons. One, you know, we've been talking about sovereignty a little bit. I mean, in my opinion, and you asked me if it was crypto or Bitcoin before, for a number of reasons, but the primary one being Bitcoin has the greatest probability and chance of resisting change, of actually being incorruptible and immutable, i.e. via censorship resistance, whether censorship is from the state or an individual actor or a group of people that are well-intended but have the wrong opinion of things. Like, just it's the most immutable. And the fact that it's immutable is so very important. And that's why I place all of my emphasis and time on that one specifically. Not to say that there will never be any use case or value in anything else. The market is saying that there is right now. How long that lasts, if that's something that maintains into the future, I don't know. But I do know that the most important thing, as far as I can see, is Bitcoin. And the fact that it is this way of communicating value without an intermediary is a re-sanctification, in my opinion, or actually a greater sanctification than we've ever had of the sovereignty of the individual. Because if you can protect the value of your work, the time and energy that you've expended and the surplus you've generated as a result of that, if you can protect that in a way that nobody can touch it or take it from you, and you can send it and communicate it in a similar fashion, then yeah, I mean, that speaks to the divine sovereignty of each individual. And in a practical way, out in the culture and in the world and the economy as it exists today, all those intermediaries and all those institutions that derive their power from various forms of dependency, derive their power as a result of a lack of the ability for the individual to preserve their sovereignty. That's why they all exist, right? And so what is the function of government when they can't surreptitiously or overtly tax their citizens, right? Whether it's a coerced, overt tax, like you owe 30% of your income, or it's the far more insidious one of inflation, where they're able to siphon off as much as they want of the wealth of their citizenry. What happens to the main institutions that benefit from closeness and access to capital, like big business around the world today? What happens when that revolving door between big business and government shrinks as a result of both of those institutions being disempowered in various ways by a growing empowerment of the individual? Yeah. So this is why and I don't think I've done a great job at explaining this, but why I think the kind of spiritual domain and this seemingly separate domain of technology and money is far more wrapped up with each other than people initially think. And I guess yeah.
No, I agree, because within our cultural immaturity that we may be coming out of, there's a parasitic relationship, like you said, right, between those who are creating the rules and siphoning energy in the form of resources, time, currency, which is really time and energy, and creativity. As we mature, we are extricating ourselves from that unconscious relationship. So living within the shadow of that cultural parasitic relationship, and in many ways a necessary relationship, perhaps for many people, and may still be, just because it requires a lot of agency and sovereignty to be able to extricate oneself and take self-responsibility for one's sustenance. But that is the maturity of the spirit, right? So as we're renegotiating this relationship of the collective, I think for us, those of us who choose to mature into greater states of awareness, we need to take our sovereignty back from these institutions and these relationships. So Bitcoin offers that. And it's kind of like this immaculate gift right now, which offers the maturity to be put back into our hands and to claim self-responsibility. And responsibility for oneself is no small task. Like that's a huge thing that we're all
talk about courage, right?
Big time courage, big time expansion and bandwidth, capacity to process information, and really taking authorship of our experience in our life. So, as we do that, yeah, I totally concur that Bitcoin is this tool to shift from a parasitic relationship to completely dissociating and like unplugging ourselves from these tentacles that siphon our energy, and freeing ourselves so that our awareness and this attention economy, our attention now is realigned into productive, generative aspects of life, as opposed to aspects that siphon our energy, our creativity, and actually make us submit to working systems that don't really help us evolve, but just make us, like a lot of work is generally processing things that don't really lead anywhere. They're just processes that give you money in exchange, right? So yeah, big time. I'm excited about the potential of this and where it will go.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. And you made me think when you talk about that it's no small task to take that, because this is the piece that's often missed, right? People talk about freedom and sovereignty, but the other side of that coin is responsibility. And I think in many ways, even though the tools haven't always been there to make it easier or even available at all, that's not why people are so asleep as they are, right? Because it is still possible to wake up or have some degree of sovereignty. What's happened, it seems, is that we've voluntarily chosen in many cases to take the easier option, which is ultimately dependence on some other person or some other institution. You tell me what's best for my health. You take care of my health. You take care of my money. You take care of my this. You make sure my access to food, like all of these things. And we can all appreciate that, right? Because convenience is our way of accessing more time, and time is one of the experience of time, at least, and that's one of the most scarce things we have. So yeah, we want more time so that we can have more experience of life, and convenience is an avenue, or at least we think it is an avenue of getting more of it. But what do we give up in that trade? And I think modern culture is an example of having gone way too far in giving up something of greater value than the convenience you're getting back in return. And we're starting to see the consequences of that. And I think, as you say, what's happening with Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is presenting perhaps a more overt choice in that dynamic that's ever been presented, and saying, hey, do you want greater freedom and sovereignty that then has ever been available to, let's say, a human being inside of a culture? And if the answer is yes, then it's also saying, here's the responsibilities that you have to accept in order to gain access to that. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people have a aversive reaction to that, it's because, like, hey, too scary, too much responsibility. I don't want to do that. But the flip side is more and more people all the time are trickling in and saying, yeah, that's a trade I will make, because I increasingly realize and recognize the value of freedom and sovereignty in whatever ways I can manifest it. And if it requires my courage, if it requires my work, if it requires me to overcome elements of myself that are less refined than I would like, then I'm going to engage those things and approach those deficiencies so that I can actually avail of that opportunity that's now in front of me. Mm-hmm. And I see that happening a lot with people that are kind of way down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. And, just to tie a knot on the value conversation we were having before, it's interesting what happens when value is more properly arranged and you're more oriented around, and your orientation of value, I'm lacking the right words, but is more properly arranged by some means. And what I found is that when that happens, and particularly, so let's assume that Bitcoin is providing access to sovereignty and freedom, the likes of which may never have existed again in the sociocultural realm. Let's just assume that for the sake of this conversation. Then the value of that instrument is, for people that value freedom, is almost infinite, right? It's as valuable as a thing in relation to other people can be. And as a result, I find that it causes a separation between it and everything else of lesser, let's say, frivolous value in one's life. Because let's just say that the opportunity cost puts so much pressure on everything that our modern consumerist culture, right? I'm sure we all discuss this often. But the fact that Bitcoin exists as this extreme kind of gravity well of value, what I see happening is people start to look at their life and say, like, well, would I rather buy that new 50-inch TV or would I rather increase my sovereignty and freedom by putting that into the gravity well that is Bitcoin? And what you see with the, the more hardcore among us is that they end up leading fairly like aesthetic lives, like, and we have a number of jokes in the space, like, if you still have chairs, you're short Bitcoin, sort of thing, right? Because everything of relatively lesser value gets subsumed by this thing of greater value. And what I find super interesting about that is what remains when that process occurs. And again, it seems to me to be, and I'm sure I have my own biases in many ways, but what remains is the things that aren't subject to the opportunity cost of that gravity well, i.e. the things that cannot be valued. What I mentioned earlier, transcendent values like beauty, love, health, relationships, nature. These things, you can't put a price on them like a 50-inch flat screen, right? And so what seems to be happening is that because of that proper orientation of the thing of greatest interpersonal value, you get a separation of frivolous market value, let's call it, and transcendent value. And the latter becomes more apparent to people as they go through this journey. And so again, you can't separate that from the spiritual pursuits, because what are the spiritual pursuits other than trying to determine the things of greatest value and then refining them and leaning into them and integrating them to the extent possible. And I actually think that Bitcoin is facilitating that journey tremendously.
Yeah, again, totally, I agree. Extricating oneself from that, reevaluating. Yeah, for sure, it makes sense. One thing that occurred to me while you were speaking is also getting in right relationship with, well, it's the same thing that you're saying, with our value system. And one thing that occurs to me when I think of Bitcoin, or even spreading it out to cryptocurrencies, is if we're not aligned with a higher purpose, I think things can go easily into greed. It's very, very normal, in accumulation and the feeling of lack and emptiness that needs to be filled. And then there's the other aspect, which is a more noble aspect, seeing ourselves as creative nodes in a network and an ecosystem of expansion, and being of service to that, while also being of service to ourselves and our own expansion. So from there, I think one thing that I'm seeing, I'm sorry I'm deviating, but this has been on my mind, is with certain blockchains, and I'm not very fluent or current with everything, but certain blockchains I'm seeing, are being coerced and used by empire for purposes that are not very good. That means like the VPass or any other sort of like really enslaving systems of the social credit score, and even more nefarious aspects are put onto some of these, emergingly successful blockchains. And investing in that and supporting that, it's interesting, because there's a lot of incentive to do so, and it's kind of sexy and it's profitable, and it seems maybe even like counterculture in some ways, but at the same time it's really actually fortifying empire and creating this actual prison system. So if we're not aligned properly to why we are doing this and what the process is that we're going through, then I think this fallen world, this kind of Maya that we're in, can grasp some of these unclarified value systems within ourselves and really seduce us into doing things for the ecosystem of nodes that is degenerative and quite damaging. But anyway, that's
that's a great okay. Point. Let's hang on to that one for a second. I agree fully, and this is why I don't know if you've interacted with the Bitcoin space much, but on first impression, some people come in and they get a sense that like this is a very abrasive, toxic sort of place. And my response to that has always been, really? So you're telling me that your pursuit of truth is so feeble that some nasty words and some bad attitudes or whatever is going to keep you from pursuing that line of inquiry? Well, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to say that maybe it's not as genuine as you might like to think, right? That's kind of my initial response to that. But your point is well made, and it is a good one. And what I would say is this: is blockchain, the Bitcoin blockchain exists to resist censorship. maintain immutability. You know, and ostensibly that's what blockchains exist for. It doesn't make much sense for the censor to have a blockchain, because, you know, then all they're doing is they're preserving their capacity as the censor, right? So we're going to see a lot of these central bank digital currencies emerge. You know, I think we would all agree that the current monetary systems globally, the fiat monetary system, which this year turned 50 years old, is at the end of its rope. And what do you know? There's a circumstance that kind of emerged that allowed for a real nail to be put in the coffin, which is this enormous debt and money printing that all countries have been doing over the last 18 months, right? Whatever theory you ascribe to, whatever, you know, it doesn't really matter. But the point is I think they will invoke these central bank digital currencies as a solution to the problems that end up emerging as a result of the treatment of this system and the operation of this system. Those will be bad for sure, right? Those are greater degree of control, greater degree of centralization, greater degree of surveillance, greater degree of censorship, everything. The reason why I focus on Bitcoin is because all that matters here is what is the greatest source of truth, i.e. what can we use to orient our values and communicate value that has the least likelihood of ever being corrupted, and that is Bitcoin. And so, like I said before, all of these, because you're right, I mean, let's say a huge portion of the actors in the space are either the censor themselves or other groups of people that are just chasing easy money and it's a hype thing and that's what's going on. I'm willing to admit that there's probably other projects that have well-intended and well-meaning groups of people working on them. In my opinion, they're just not properly valuing what this phenomenon represents. And as a result, they're not engaging in the one that's most likely to net the greatest benefit. And so again, hence the focus on Bitcoin. But there was one thing that you mentioned where people had to be careful to, you know, the aspect of greed, right? And to not become empty and to fill themselves up with the right things. I think you're right. And that's a balance everybody has to strike. But I also think it's interesting that one's greed, as I was articulating before, one's greed for Bitcoin almost seems to empty people out of the detritus, right? The bullshit that's been accumulated, the perverse system and objects of value that have resulted from their conditioning in this culture, seems to empty them out of that and fill them up with those things of transcendent value that I was referring to. And so I don't want to say that's exclusively what happens, because, like, again, another trope in the space is like everybody's short Bitcoin, like everybody wants more Bitcoin. And so everyone works hard and tries to accumulate as much as possible. And, you know, of course, that can fall into the realm of obsession. But I think for most people, it falls into the former realm that I was discussing, where empties the bad stuff, fills it up with good. And then as a result of being in this networking community of people who perceive value in a similar way, what it motivates is a desire for each individual to contribute real value, because real value is a far more clear prospect now. And so my observation of people that are in this space is they see it, they get it, they're set on fire with a desire to learn and understand more. And then what they want to do is produce value. They want to listen to the signal that's coming from that space and try to use their talents, their work, their time, their energy to produce value to it in order to receive that in return. And again, there's definitely a danger there, but I think it's more opportunity or more good than bad, for lack of a better term.
Totally. I hear you. And I think my comment was more geared toward certain other altcoins, especially technology serving, you know, like Great Reset, Agenda 21 goals and stuff like that.
Right.
And you know, as you were saying, it's interesting. I feel like I got this image of like, it's very cool how you're framing this, like putting all this unnecessary stuff into Bitcoin. In a way, it's starving the system, it's starving the beast, which needs to be starved, right?
That's exactly right.
The parasitic relationship. So by starving it, it's like renegotiating our value systems, extracting our energy in the form of resources or commitments or whatever it is, and putting that in Bitcoin, which right now is, mythologically speaking, it's this orange totem, right? And it's this totem that we're like energizing. Of course, I just want to, like, playing devil's advocate, I do want to caution, like, the idolatry aspect of consciousness is interesting also to be in right relationship with, because we don't
pause on that. Let's hit that one next, because I'd love to talk about it.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
if I wanted you to not lose the train of thought.
For sure. I think I was almost done there, but I think I'm just like riffing on this, and I think it is cool to start the system, put it in this sort of like boon right now. That's again a totem pole, and mythologically, I think we both speak that language and appeals to me. And what happens from there is going to be interesting, because I think what's going to be broadcast is based on the collective magic, the collective sort of like magic we can imbue with our agreements, and start projecting this new world from that totem, right?
Exactly. Extremely well put. And so, but again, wanting to have as broad a view of this as possible. I agree, and we've referred to it as a pillar, as a totem of truth, of sovereignty, of freedom, of proper value orientation. And as you say, I think, we talk about the Bitcoin Renaissance a lot, and part of the reasoning for that comes from an analysis of monetary history, and kind of looking at why the qualities of the money have downstream effects on culture and society, and perhaps the greatest downstream effects on those things, and why we have this, again, another trope. We say, fix the money, fix the world. And of course, that's overly simplistic, but the point is clear in that if you can fix the money, then a lot of the things downstream from it, the institutions, the relationships, all of those things are greatly rectified, and a renaissance can emerge from that, as you were articulating. But what is to use analogies to other, mythological understandings or realms, what are the dangers of having totems that you rely on to such a degree?
Well, I think we can go into absolutism, right? And creating, again, the idolatry is creating a god of something, of a framework, any framework that may be helpful. But if we put too many of our resources or into energizing that as sort of the absolute wholeness of everything, it I think. And I'm not saying that that's happening. It's just a danger of the human mind tends to go into absolutes to have certainty and to have a grasp on things. But yeah, I don't have a full conviction of this. I think I guess we're thinking our way into this, but what are the pitfalls? I guess being blindsided to perhaps being open to other pathways that are analogous, that are helpful, maybe not being a bit too firm and rigid with certain frameworks. I think those are the general threats that come up whenever we I think give all power to anything, however functional it is, something that proves successful for us.
Let me ask you this, because I don't have, on that particular topic, nothing's really emerging for me. Like, I don't get me wrong, I understand. Like, we can't go into anything without a consciousness of the threats, the risks, the positive, negative. There's a positive, negative side of everything, right? So if we want to extract the most of the positive, I think we need to be aware of the extent of the negative. And that may even be the very process that allows us to do that. We touched on Mircea Eliade, or however you pronounce his name, a bit earlier. And he coined this term that, I'm trying to articulate some of these thoughts in a written piece that I'll be releasing hopefully next week. But he coined this term hierophanies. And these are things that he describes as things that manifest the sacred in the world. And my understanding of how he articulates they do that is that they are a greater representation of deep truth than relative to other things. And so again, this kind of gets back to the notion that, like, why is truth so valuable? Well, I think it might be because it opens up, it broadens the bandwidth with what is. And if what is the thing of greatest value, like the source, God, whatever, then truth is And the degree of truth is how you communicate with it, and how much and to what degree you communicate with it. And I think he would say that the hierophanies are things that allow you to expand your relationship to God, source, the divine, etc. And the reason why you made me think of it is because, like, well, whether it's an idea or an object, it could become that totem, right? So I guess my question was like, well, okay, if we accept that premise, and of course I understand many will not, but if we accept that the sacred does manifest itself in different relative capacities and amounts in the world, in varying ideas and objects and everything, and people and everything, what is the proper relationship to have to it, right? Like, how do you not fall prey to the negative aspects of idolatry, let's say? Because if you really believe that the sacred has been manifest in the world, and you've identified it, and you can engage with it, then that's, by virtue of that belief, it's going to manifest a very strong affinity to that thing, a very strong reaction, and you're going to want to inquire about it and use it and integrate it to the extent possible. But is it exclusively good? Well, if it's closeness to God, what Eliade would say, like the hierophanies, sorry, just a last statement on it, is an ability to develop a closer relationship with God in symbol, idea, or form. Is there a negative aspect of that?
I think this is such a beautiful inquiry that's emerging from this. It's really fascinating. So I really like the way you put that. I think it is a vessel, could be a vessel of the divine, to the degree that we collect those people in the space of it, collectively imbue it with higher meaning, aligned with higher values, right? The degree to which the ecosystem is littered with like lower value systems, which I don't think it is, then it will be dissonant to the higher source, right? So if we imbue it with these higher values, and one of them being starving the beast system, or starving the fallen world of illusions, that means there's a freeing that's happening. That already is aligned with higher values. That means more truth is coming into the world by virtue of lessening untruth, right? So, and then the other part is, are we collectively then within the, I don't know what I'm saying, I'm not that involved in the Bitcoin system, but I hear
I'm sure you will be soon.
Exactly. And for camaraderie's sake, within the spirit of the community, I want to align myself to it, brotherhood, sisterhood, whatever. Are we then exhibiting those values that are higher values, such as, do we see ourselves as nodes within a network that's harmonizing on higher orders and greater octaves of experience? Are we offering more and more growth for all to come onto, this sort of like train, or this totem, to expand the aperture of our vision, of our attention, of our, even down to like love, joy, and ease of being on this planet. So I think it's just basically to the degree that we show up and use this tool for higher values, is the degree to which it will be aligned and infused by the divine source. Because I think totems, just generally the way they work, and my understanding of them is, they resonate with whatever their archetype is. So if you carve something that looks like a frog, or a rock of a certain sort that resonates within that mineral kingdom, or what the archetype within Maya represents. And sorry, I'm convoluting this, but ultimately, it has to resonate with the higher frequency. That's the.
I think 2 points I'd like to respond to that. One is, I agree with you. We have to be careful not to assume to necessarily know what the, quote unquote, resonance with the higher octave, or however we want to characterize this, that looks like in relation to something that's novel. Because we have our ideas of what that looks like, and we've discussed many of them in this conversation. But if we're encountering the emergence of something that is truly novel, then we have to be careful not to prejudge what emerges as a result of interaction with that, because we haven't experienced it yet. We haven't contextualized it yet. We haven't determined what the proper expression that emerges from that necessarily is, right? The other interesting thing is you said we imbue the idol, the object, the idea. I think in certain cases, and this may indeed be the power, the idea of the hierophany or the idol, how you maybe kind of classify them in some way or determine their scope or whatever, is how much they imbue the people that interact with it. And I think it's clear from what I've discussed around it so far that, like, I think that's the case. And I'll use that's happening with Bitcoin. And I'll use two examples. One, I think just generally speaking, like, well, let me start with this, with truth, right? Like, one of the reasons why I have such a dedication to pursuing truth is because I know the work of my faith is that actual truth is transformative. And if it hasn't transformed you, you haven't encountered it, you know? And I almost do that. Well, I think that's the most efficient way of seeking knowledge and wisdom, is not always fighting tooth and nail for it. But if you can just try to, again, open that aperture, see with the utmost clarity, if it is actually truth and you believe it to be, it will transform you. And, you know, of course, the question is, how does it transform you? What elements of yourself does it diminish? What elements does it promote or expand? But I think, and so truth has an element of absoluteness. And if we carry that over to this phenomenon, anomaly in Bitcoin, what would be the expected result of encountering an unchanging absolute truth? And I think it's relatively fair to say, well, if the thing can't be changed, then the other part of that equation is the thing that must change as a relationship. So if the truth, if the thing is, if it's not possible for that to change, then I think the person who engages it is the only one susceptible to change. And therefore the impetus or the drive is almost entirely on them to change. And then the reason, you know, the feed into what you were saying is, how do these totems of truth not just become things that we imbue with meaning? How do they imbue us? And I would say, one, they're absolute, so that we can't change them. And so they at the very least, they also imbue us. Let's not say it's only a one-way street, but they imbue us. And the question is, well, with what? Well, let's look at their characteristics. What meaning, what characteristics are they emitting? And, you know, maybe we don't want to get too stuck in the weeds with analyzing the details of Bitcoin, but let's just say one in particular is that everyone is accorded the same treatment and respect and fairness, i.e., the rules of the game are the same for everybody and nobody can cheat. So you have truth and fairness as a fundamental characteristic of this unchanging totem. And so as a result, I think if we agree that that unchangingness allows for it to imbue people that interact with it, then its characteristics, in this case, trust, truth, and fairness, also become ideals and values that it imbues in the people that interact with it. And then what you might expect to see is that the people that most interact with it most embody and express those ideals that have been imbued in them or awakened within them, however that process works. And I think that's what we're seeing, right? Like I literally think that the relationship that people are establishing with this thing, part of that is them being imbued with, or the latent elements within themselves being amplified by the very representation of those characteristics in the unchanging thing.
That's beautiful. I would agree with that totally. So that you can't walk into the field of this, was it hierophany?
I think so. I don't know how to pronounce
it. I think I'll just say totem because it's to walk into the field of this totem, you have to engage it by its own rules. And these rules, and with Bitcoin, are embedded within its structure. And that structure is absolute and immutable. from what I understand. And so, yeah, to engage with it, one has to activate those aspects of oneself. So that's the fairness, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I would agree that it then has this field which affects those who engage with it and actually motivates and incentivizes a more coherent and fair and just way of showing up and interacting with each other. That's interesting. And since we're, I guess, philosophizing here, I'll just one thing that I was wondering
just a little bit.
yeah, and kind of like just considering things, because I have no, either way, I'm just riffing with you. Don't have full convictions on this, but I'm really loving exploring and making sense of it based on like your understanding and your what I imagine is expertise in the field. So one thing that I wanted to bring to this, and let's see what happens with it, is, so I heartily accept the emanation and the frequency that this totem exudes and the influence it has on all who engage with it. And then the reverse, as we agree that there is some of that, what people project onto that totem changes their personal relationship. But I wonder if what the effect is when a larger group agrees on the projection that they put on this thing, and what happens within the relationship then. What I see in the Bitcoin sphere, from just what I see, is a very healthy projection. So I think there's a healthy kind of like relationship with it. All the OGs, the Bitcoin OGs, there's a held ground of like generally understanding what the game is, and so I think it's healthy. And I wonder, I just wanted to share this with you. Maybe you're aware of it. In esoterica and esoteric lore, there's something called the egregore. And the egregore is a collection of thought forms of human beings who align based on a certain sort of agreements on a certain theme, topic, event, whatever it is. And the egregore over time actually forms its own independent thought form. And this thought form now actually exerts influence on the thinkers or the adherents. So this has happened with any political movement, any large ideology. You can track that and how it actually has its own set of rules, beliefs, and actions. And people, we see this now with kind of like a lot of combative activism that we've been seeing much more in the last 5 years. A lot of these kind of like mimetic tribes that we're seeing. So each one has an egregore, which if you don't play according to its rules, it kind of spits you out, right? Or will destroy you depending on how you engage it. If you oppose it fully head on, it has so much power and amplitude that it will kind of crush you. And there's ways to deal with it. And so I guess this is just like a philosophical inquiry. I'm not saying there's anything negative into it, but I'm applying that to Bitcoin. I wonder if the healthy and harmonious amplitude would increase. And I guess it would. I think I'm answering my own question, is when the adherents around the central pillar of absoluteness are also imbuing it back with actually reflecting to it these noble, virtuous approaches. And maybe perhaps there's a feedback loop that can occur that gives it more and more power, and that resonates much wider. And so anyone that comes in to join this sphere of activity is either aligns to these higher values, or by virtue of the values is spit out if they don't want to play according to them. So if you have someone with a lower controlling kind of consciousness within the central banking system or any of its iterations, trying to come into this space with the same mentality of wanting their dirty little tentacles to do what they do, then it's very likely that they won't be able to stay within it. So they try to subvert it from without. I guess, sorry, man, I'm just kind of like making sense of this. I don't think I'm saying anything concrete, but I was trying to make sense of that relationship for myself, I guess. But yeah, please, if you have anything to say.
Well, first of all, I'm more than content to sit here and watch you make sense of things on your own as much as you want to do. So don't worry about that. But I would say that you've hit the nail on the head. That perfectly characterizes what's happening to people that are holding the totem, as it were, to people in the community. And this is kind of why I referred to earlier, one, that it can seem abrasive to some people, and it draws criticism for that. But the reason why I said we should be careful not to to prejudge what sort of behavior or action this totem elicits because it's totally novel. And so some people might come in, and here's the thing that I find so deliciously amusing and ironic all the time, is because I know who a lot of these people are, right? Had long, deep conversations with them, have met many of them in person. Like, I know them on a very deep level. And I wouldn't be here if it weren't for the fact that these people that I'm engaging with are, I hate to use this cliche term, but the most awakened, the most sincere, the most honest, the most truthful. It doesn't mean that they're perfect and that they're going to appeal to everyone's sensibilities, but they're being as genuine as they can be, as honest as they can be, pursuing truth as much as they can. And that is what I appreciate more than anything. Whether I like you or not, or whether I like, more than likely, because our values coalesce around those things to such a degree, we probably are going to get along. But like, even if I disagree with some of your opinions, like, that is what I value. And as a result of that, to use a real world example, there was a Bitcoin conference in Miami in June, and there was 13,000 people there, and we'd all been locked up for 18 months, and many of us had never met, and we all got there. And I've never been in a circumstance where people were operating on such a similar wavelength before, that people that I'd never met, and in many cases only ever interacted with their avatar and false name on Twitter, right? Pseudonymous accounts and that kind of stuff, would meet them and immediately give them like one of those tight squeezes that you give to people that, you're very affectionate with. And you end up just hanging out in perfect harmony, really, or like, really, really jiving well. And so to answer your question, people that come into this space with humility and a genuine pursuit of truth. I mean, you have to be humble if you have a genuine pursuit of truth, right? I would make that claim. But if you have that one or those two attributes, you'll be received with open arms. People will try to help you in whatever way they can, provide resources, explanations. But as you say, if you're the central banker, if you're the academic who thinks they know it all, if you're the Nobel Prize winning economist, whatever, and you come in and you presume to know, and you project your hubris and your arrogance and your presumptions on those people, well, they're going to give you a spanking unlike you've ever seen, right? The moniker of cyber hornets was bestowed on the group, on the community, about a year ago by an influential American businessman who went down the rabbit hole and was quote unquote converted. That's Michael Saylor. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but so the point is like it seems, on first pass, it might seem as though these are not the elevated, properly value-oriented, humble, truth-seeking individuals that I've been sold. These people look like a bunch of maniacs. But it is, as you say, how you approach it. Who are you showing up as to approach that community? And that will very much determine how you're approached as a result of that. And I think I love it as a type of filter, because it does separate the wheat from the chaff in a way. Because like I said earlier, I mean, I think this would probably apply to both of us. Like, I think we probably have both pursued truth with such dedication that, the discomfort of the Peruvian Amazon, or the nasty words from someone on Twitter, or the anxiety and the stress and the pressure and the discomfort of engaging the world in whatever way is insufficient to push us off that course, because we believe in the ultimate value of truth. And so if you can't if you're turned away at the gates by a few pseudonymous people with lasers in their eyes, calling you mean names, then maybe you're not ready to, maybe you weren't really on that journey in the first place, and you have other work to do first,
Yeah, I always see that stuff as like mini agent Smiths that are just part of the system to try to deter you. And within, even like without using a technological metaphor, just within the conscious and unconscious interplay of like the field of consciousness, whenever you really mean it, and whenever you're crystallizing higher levels of consciousness, the unconscious will always try to like grasp really strongly on that. So those kind of snipes that you're talking about are like part of the process. And they're great little tests for us, right? Like, how much do I mean this? How much do I value truth? And then we can sort of like dust them off. And every time we do, we fill those gaps with like sovereignty and agency, right? And they're just showing us where we are kind of like maybe have some holes in our game.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, I witnessed some of the banter that goes on. And, occasionally you might look at an interaction and you might be like, that was just unnecessarily aggressive, right? Unnecessarily so. But my approach is this: what's the negative aspect of the unnecessary aggression? I'll use it in relation to myself, right? Of course, I'm on the internet, I'm online, people call me a fucking idiot all the time, or whatever else, right? That literally does not affect me whatsoever. I mean, it doesn't penetrate me at all. So the detriment of that action is nil, right? But the value of that individual, even though, let's say there's some sort of perverse thing, they're misinterpreting me, there's some anger and frustration in them that's manifesting in that critique of me in that moment, right? Let's just accept that. But they're also expressing the truth of that. However, to whatever degree, we might say those things shouldn't exist within them. The fact is that they're allowing themselves to express the truth of that, let's say, frustration. And in a world where the cages that most of us are in are by our own making, the social pressure and the expectations and the conditioning and all that, I just simply, in relative terms, I value the act of expressing yourself genuinely, even if inappropriately, versus the completely nil positive or negative of how it affects me. So occasionally when I see people being a little bit like off base, I still lean toward being like, good for you, because at least there was like the courage or the impetus to be genuine in that moment with that emotion, even if it wasn't necessarily a good one. Do you know what I'm saying?
No, I agree. It's not a veiled reaction. It's a real reaction, I suppose. So,
right. Yeah.
Totally.
And the last thing on this particular point is, I think belief systems and fundamental coordinating mechanisms of trading our time, energy, and work. So money, I would say, is the foundation of that, and the economic systems that are built on top of that. So those two core things, and obviously belief and money, are deeply wound up with one another. I think part of this enterprise that we're all on is actually determining what money is. And I think as we move forward through this, we will develop a deeper appreciation for what money is, far beyond the simple functions that we currently describe it as. But nevertheless, I think what's happening here is the foundations of the future global civilization. And I know that may sound arrogant in itself, but an unchanging totem of value communication, I think, is kind of the thing that is the best at doing that, becomes the foundation for civilization. And because it's so advantageous to have a tool like that, whether it be, again, in the past, like in the religious realm or in the monetary realm or what have you, means that the group of people, the network that adopt that, become competitively advantaged versus the others. And that's how the culture and the civilization grows and grows and grows and grows until it becomes dominant. And my opinion, that's what's happening around Bitcoin. And it's still so early, of course. But what I value so much is that, whether the idol is imbuing us, and to whatever degree we're imbuing it, the outcome is that these ideas and these values and these principles are all being recontextualized, right? They're being brought out of ourselves into the public forum of both action and communication, and they're being refined, and the proper value of each of them is being determined so that they can be reintegrated. And that, I mean, that is, you would expect that for the emergence of a new civilizational underpinning, I think, but also it's so exciting, man. I mean, just think about it. Like, I know the world is so fucked up, and you know, we've discussed a lot of that already, but I genuinely believe we are determining what the foundations of a new one should and can be. And we're all actively, you know, many of us are actively participating in that process. And what could be more hopeful than that, really? You know, and that's why I think so many of us are imbued with enthusiasm and energy around this.
Yeah, I agree. And that's like that's like the prime tool, I think, right now. The prime resource is being energized with positive generative energy that then we can communicate to everyone else and keep that high energy that's creative and moving forward. Yeah, I completely agree with you. And you know, the fact that things are quote unquote fucked up is actually a great sign, because if we're to transform or change or recreate anything, the old has to collapse. And you know, we have to keep repeating this to remind ourselves that is like part of this whole potential renaissance. And like, to say it in different words, I'm just going to reiterate what you're saying is our reality and our culture, our experience in this world is based upon a series of collective agreements. And so these collective agreements, by and large, were not consciously chosen by us. They're artifacts of other systems of thought and of history. Some of them are functional, there's functional traditions, and many are unfunctional and disempowering and degenerative. So I think a lot of us right now are peeking our heads out of the waters of the unconscious and being like, hey, let's renegotiate these collective agreements. And by renegotiating these relationships, these agreements we have about institutions, about economies, about interpersonal relationships, about our relationship to power, personal power, nature, life, the good life, whatever it is, we are actually recreating the structure of reality, because we're putting the thought forms in first, and then we're following those up with concrete action, and that manifests in change in the world. So yeah, this renegotiation around stable things that we agree upon is like absolutely essential. And as we do that, things that don't work will collapse, and there's going to be some discomfort as we take responsibility. And like, how do we now offset, like, how do we accommodate, or how do we do the things that were done for us before, whether that's like sense making by corrupt media agencies that were making sense of the world for us. Now we have to do it accurately, sometimes not. And everything else we're going to have to start doing for ourselves, not only as individuals, but maybe that's quite a burden, but as collectives who are harmonizing to each other. And we're going to do that in a higher order than has ever been done. We're going to do it better. We're going to do it in a way that's much more satisfying, much more fulfilling. And I imagine that the collective resonance of all these actions is going to create a fever pitch of like sublime bliss at some point, you know, that comes out of hardship. It comes out of resilience and triumphs and victories. And these are the thoughts and the eventualities that really empower me day to day. So yeah, renegotiating what's real. Or no, not renegotiating what's real, calibrating to what's real and renegotiating our agreements to it, I guess.
Calibrating to what's real and renegotiating our agreements to it.
Yeah.
I like that a lot.
Yeah.
That's very, very well said. What's your time situation like? You gotta bail?
Yeah, I gotta go. I have quite a few tasks ahead of me.
Yeah, of course. And I really appreciate the time. I want to do this again because there's a lot more to discuss. But for now, I think that spiel you just gave is a perfect place to end it. And I guess my only last question is, what are you working on? Is there going to be another manifestation like in shadow in the foreseeable?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, there's been some sort of like responsibility and some kind of guilt in me since I released In Shadow. A lot of people, you know, want a sequel and want Into Light or something analogous to that.
Yeah.
And I feel much more up to the task to do that now than I have been before, just because I've been maturing in my own sense of self. And I think we need a rallying cry of victory and vision right now. And I think that's a very necessary piece of art to come out. Something like that may come out in the new year. Maybe we'll see. see if the resources are aligned. Because up until now, as I said at the beginning of the conversation, I've been negotiating my own path of like self-sustenance and like creative endeavors. So before what I just said is made, I have to finish something else that I'm working on. It's work for hire, but I kind of made it my own, and I'm very grateful for the production company that's supporting me on this, and I'm supporting them by making it. It's a short sci-fi kind of dystopian short film about social credit score and a system similar to the Great Reset, set in Russia in the near future, and a virtual reality realm that siphons the consciousness of basically kids from their VR sets. There's like hacking and other things going on. So it has to do with sovereignty, will, and how we turn into non-player characters, both spiritually and figuratively and literally in video games from player one, which is the sovereign being. So it's kind of like a bleak tale of how we give away our free will in exchange for approval, social credits, and stuff like that within a system of horror, really, this Great Reset kind of system.
Well, that sounds like a very powerful endeavor in itself. So, anxiously anticipate that. But man, I thank you so much for the time. I'm extremely grateful for it, as well as for your work in Shadow and whatever is to come. I love having this conversation with you. I love the perspective that you have and that you're able to articulate and share. So, I look forward to doing it again sometime. Yeah,
man, me too. Again, and just to mirror that back to you, I had a pleasure speaking to you, unfolding all these concepts, and I got a lot of value from what you said. I actually do want to re-listen to this and take some notes. So yeah, I do hope we speak again.
Awesome, man. Well, I'm sure we'll be in touch, and when the time is right, we'll do it again. So until then, take care.
All right, brother. Take care.